helpful. Great. All right. Welcome to the webinar today. We are a group of Rhodes Scholars and residents from the Indian constituency who are going to be answering questions later in the session, but initially we're going to answer some questions we've already prepared on how to process and approach this written round, which is the first round of the application. And it can be quite intimidating. I know it was for me, but hopefully this session and whatever questions you can answer will help navigate that in a more straightforward and intuitive way. So first off, this session is going to be recorded. And the way that we're going to structure this is we're going to spend the first 45 minutes answering questions, just ask the panelists, and then we will take questions from the participants in the next 45 minutes. So before that, I'm going to send a few messages to like just as general information where you can get questions. And maybe finally, it's really important to know that this is an informal gathering. It's not really, we're not meant to be representatives of the trust. And we're not going to give official, anything we say is not official guidance, basically. So, all right, I think we're ready to start. Cool. So I guess I wanted to start by just introducing the people on the panel. And I guess we could start with, I'm just starting with whoever I see first on my screen. So Aishwarya, would you like to start and then popcorn it to someone?
Hey, Namu, thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of the webinar. And hi to everyone on the chat, all the attendees that have joined. I'm Aishwarya. I'm a 2022 Rhodes Scholar from India, and I'm currently studying a master's in neuroscience at Oxford here. And I hope to start off with my DPhil in neuroscience this October. And I'm from St. John's College. I'm happy to meet you all. And Suchintan, would you like to continue?
Yeah, thank you, Aishwarya. Hi, everyone. My name is Suchintan, India, Hartford, 2021. I came up in Oxford to do an MSc in Global and Imperial History, and I'm now doing a DPhil in History at Merton College. So I'm also really excited to be a part of this panel. Misbah, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be on this panel to talk about the many queries that you'll be having right now. I am a 2021 scholar as well, like Suchintan. I am a lawyer by training, and then when I came to Oxford, I did my master's in women's gender and sexuality studies, and now I'm doing my DPhil in law. Now back to you.
Great. And I guess I should introduce myself as well. My name is Namu. I'm also in the Indian constituency. I'm Corpus Christi and India and Corpus Christi 2020. So that means that I joined in 2020 class and I'm in the College of Corpus Christi and I'm doing my PhD in material science. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And I think we should start answering some questions. So the first question I have for the panelists are, I guess, what would be the top piece of advice that you would give someone approaching the written round? And you can give more than one, of course, but I guess whatever comes to mind, so we can use that as a way to start this conversation. And maybe this time I will go with the person I see last on my screen. Suchintan, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So what I had in mind and sort of my experience of preparing for the application round way back when it was the COVID year of 2020. So we get selected for the scholarship that's given out for the next year. So we came up in Oxford in 2021, but we basically had the application round throughout 2020. And it was the nature of the time that gave me a lot of latitude to think deeply about myself and what I really want out of this opportunity if I get it at that moment. So the top piece of advice would be that this is an opportunity for deep introspection. Whatever you're preparing for the written round, be that as mundane as your CV, it's not just a list of your achievements or the other pieces like the academic statement, which has now sort of, we only had a statement of purpose, personal statement, but now it has been compartmentalized into academic statement and SOP separately. But in spite of all these compartmentalizations, in spite of the fact that you have something as mundane as a CV to prepare for, each piece of these documents reflects you. So it's your opportunity to introspect and put yourself out there. It's not an imitative process, and it's not the same for everyone. It will, of course, be different from person to person. And when you realize that, you sort of get comfortable with the process itself. So yeah, that's my top advice. Introspect and don't think too much about whether you are fitting a mold, because it's not a cookie cutter experience. You will have your own sort of realities, your own aspirations, your own background that you come from. And the assessors and potential interview panelists want to look at you from that vantage point. They want to see what you want to show them.
That's really good advice, Chintan. I really resonate with that, and thank you for sharing. I guess, would you like to popcorn it to someone else?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe Aishwarya?
Hi, thanks. I guess I also really resonated with a lot of the things that you said, and I think that the introspection point that you made is really key for the written round, because again, I guess that is the best way for you to kind of crystallize your ambition and put it on paper and put it to the world. And I think one of the benefits of the written round of the Rhodes is that, like, regardless of what stages have come before that or after that, that in itself is excellent preparation for you as a person in general, because it forces you to kind of take a deep, long look at yourself. And I think that a couple of like practical points that I personally found useful were, the first thing is I made sure to check the requirements for like citizenship, education, and age, and all of that stuff first, because that's a mundane thing, but you really have to look at that and read the fine print. And it was especially so for me because I am an interjurisdictional candidate. So even though I've studied in India, I hold New Zealand citizenship. And for interjurisdictional candidates, you have to submit the key elements of your application 2 weeks in advance for them to approve you to apply from India or recommend that you apply from a different constituency. And so I think from a really like kind of mundane practical perspective, making sure that you meet all those requirements first is a really good place to start. And it gives you a sense of confidence that at least you know what you're doing in the early stages. And another thing that I found useful was also because when I looked at the description of the Rhodes scholarships and what qualities they were looking for in a Rhodes Scholar on the website. So again, once people kind of go through the main Rhodes Trust, Rhodes Scholarship website, and also the websites for India and the information for Indian candidates, I think one of the things that jumps out at you are the qualities that they look for in a Rhodes Scholar. And also, I think that especially this year for the personal statement, you actually have to answer those 3 prompts that are given and structure your statement around that. And I think that a really good first approach is to keep that in the back of your mind and just first really put down a CV before you attempt to write a statement. Because I think just having all the story of your life in a very kind of condensed bullet point format in front of you is a really good way to start thinking about how you can reframe your experience to answer these prompts and these questions. Because I feel like the fear of the blank page is a real thing, and it's something that I faced a lot, and it took me a good week to actually understand what I want to even write down in a personal statement. But having a CV written down really sped that process up, because it helped me to see, again, just a snapshot of my life so far and see how I could use different parts of my experience to answer these questions. So I think I would first recommend getting a really good handle on just the paperwork, the information for the Rhodes scholarships. And then once you have your CV in place, then also to look at what you want to do in Oxford, because again, ultimately the goal of the scholarship is to get you a spot here and make you use the opportunities here to the fullest. So being really informed on why Oxford and not another place, and what is it about this place that will uniquely help you to make the kind of impact that you want to make, is another thing that I think really needs to come across in your statements. So I would recommend first the kind of basic eligibility information, then the CV, and then read up on Oxford, and then you can start crafting your statements. But Ms. Pa, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Aishwarya. That was really nice. And just to pick up from both Chintan and Aishwarya, and maybe just add a little bit, because a lot of what they've said is what I would recommend as well. But I think one about introspection, it's completely right that this is an opportunity to sort of just reflect and understand who you are and what you're interested in. But that itself can be extremely intimidating, because we're, I think, more so in the sort of South Asian context, introspection, thinking about ourselves isn't something that comes to us naturally, and it's not a very intuitive process. So it does feel intimidating to just think about ourselves and why we want to do what we want to do. And I think maybe then using the prompts and the guidance that's given, and the document that's sort of the scholar question and answer document is the way to sort of go about answering what you want to do, and thinking about the scholarship, as Aishwarya said, as a way of facilitating what you want to do at Oxford and what you are interested in doing more generally, what you are passionate about. So rather than thinking of it as I want to get the Rhodes Scholarship, definitely that's what you want, but you want to get the Rhodes Scholarship to be able to do something. And what is it that you want to do, not just at Oxford, but more generally in life? What is it that drives you as a person? What are you passionate about? And so if you think of it in that sense, I think it becomes helpful. And I think the best way to do it is to be extremely honest and authentic. Once you sort of go through the guidance that's been written by all of the scholars, you'll see that everyone has had like different experiences in how they write their statement. Everyone comes from a different background, everyone has their own story, and that uniqueness is extremely valuable. And there isn't really a key sort of set of points that would get you the scholarship. And so to think of it in a way that, okay, I need to be able to say XYZ, and this is what will, get me the scholarship, or this is what will get me through the written round. That's not at least I wouldn't recommend that process. I would say rather think about yourself, think about who you are as a person, what is your most authentic and honest self, and then think about what is the guidance saying, how are you reflecting on the prompts, and try to match the two, rather than thinking, okay, these are the things that I need, these are the prompts, and okay, let me try to, fit things around that. So I think just to sort of be authentic and honest with yourself and what you want to do, even after you get the scholarship, would be sort of a helpful way of going about this.
All such incredible advice. Thank you all so much. One thing I may briefly add from my perspective too is, I think growing up in the Indian context for me personally, so I don't want to generalize, and also my own background in physics, and also particularly the way I think STEM is taught in India, I personally grew up in a way that looked at life quite formulaically, right? Where I really thought that, oh, there has to be this formula, and then there's this like, if I can just figure out this rule, then I can crack this process. And I think what everybody's kind of brought out here so beautifully, and which I also want to echo, is I really don't think there's a formula for this. There really isn't. I've been in residence for about 3 years at this point. I've met scholars from all over, different constituencies from our constituency. And I just feel like every person has had their own journey and their own story. And you really can't manufacture a Rhodes Scholar. I don't believe that. But what I think is also really important is you can empower yourself with knowledge through webinars like this and through all the resources that we've put in the chat that are on the Rhodes Scholarship website, our unofficial guide, the informal Google group. There's a lot of information out there. And as Aishwarya said, it's really important to just know that information and all of those sort of guidelines. And that can put you on an even playing field with everyone, because in that sense, knowledge is power. But beyond that, there really isn't anything prescriptive. So yeah, thank you all so much for sharing that. I want to ask a question more specifically on letters of recommendation and how you approached that, who you thought would be good academic references or character references, and how you feel this changed depending on your discipline, because I think there's a good spread of us amongst disciplines here. So yeah, maybe this time we have Ms. Bus start us off.
Yes, happy to. So I applied in 2021, and that year we had to submit 6 letters of references, unlike this time where you have to submit 4 to 5, out of which 3 have to be academic and 1 to 2 can be character referees. So in my year, we had to apply, we had to submit 6. And so when I was applying for the Rhodes Scholarship, I was in law school. But I was doing the 3-year law school and I'd done a graduate degree before that. So I went to Stephens to do my bachelor's, and then I came to Campus Law Center in Delhi University to do my law school. And so I had 2 institutions from which I could get academic referees. And because I was doing internships, all through undergrad and law school, I had people I could think of when I was writing my character referees. Obviously 6 is a big number, and it was even having 2 institutions and a number of professors who taught me, who I was closely working with, it was difficult to get reference letters. So so how I divided it for me was I got 2 from my undergrad, I got 2 from law school, and then I got 2 from the 2 organizations that I was interning with for a long period of time. I think for me, when I was thinking of my character FTs, and because I was in law school, so I'd done a number of law internships. There were a few lawyers who were sort of, big names, and I was really lucky to have gotten those opportunities to sort of intern with them. But I didn't interact with them as closely and as personally as I did with some other lawyers who I worked with, and I worked with for a longer period of time. It was a more intimate connection. I was doing more hands-on work with them. And so when I had to choose between whether I should ask somebody who's, a big lawyer, sort of a big name and would look good, versus somebody who knows me more personally, I thought it was better to ask somebody who knows me better, who I'd worked with for a longer period of time, who was able to really speak to our interaction and my work. And that's something that you would see as a recommendation even for applicants now, that it's always better to ask somebody who knows you better rather than someone who's just generally a big name in your field. So whether it's, history, social sciences, humanities, law, STEM, rather than asking somebody who is, a big name who you've worked with briefly. If there's somebody who you worked with for a longer period of time in a more professional setting, I would recommend asking somebody like that for your character referee. For my academic referee, for the 2 professors who I asked in my undergrad from Stephens, it was fairly easy. I asked 2 professors who had taught me of more than one course and knew me really well, had seen some of the things that I'd written, and so they happily agreed. But in my law school, it was a little tricky, and I know, and I'm sort of only sharing this because I know that it's not the same experience for everybody when they're getting a reference letter. Some institutions are obviously much more supportive to students when they are applying for scholarships or university applications. Professors in those institutions are much more familiar with all of these processes, but that's not the same in other universities, in other colleges where professors may not be as supportive, may not actually be familiar with writing reference letters or with, what is the Rhodes Scholarship, what is the course that you want to do at Oxford. And that was my experience when I was applying. I had asked a few professors who weren't willing to write my reference letter, not because they didn't think that I was a good student or whatever, but it was COVID year, so everybody was juggling many things. There were some professors who were taking really long to reply to my messages, or emails. They were taking weeks on weeks. There were some who were like, oh, maybe you should ask someone else. I don't have. There was one professor who was still finishing their PhD and was like, okay, maybe you should ask somebody who's already a PhD, who is probably already an associate professor. There was another professor who said that, oh, actually, I'm already writing a recommendation letter for somebody for the same scholarship. And they asked me first, so I can't write for you. And so it was a bit of a challenge, even with my law school, when I was asking for a recommendation letter. But I did get a professor who had taught me a few courses in law school, and who was also sort of a teacher convener for a society that I was working with. And they didn't know what the Rhodes Scholarship really was. And they were like, okay, what is this? And I had to send them like links and all of the material. I had to have a sort of chat with them, tell them, okay, this is what the scholarship is. This is what I want to do. This is what this is what I'm interested in. And they sort of knew it because, they'd seen me work on those issues. But it does take an effort. It's not an easy process. But you just have to sort of be at it. Luckily, there is still the deadline is further away compared to your written submission. So you have that time. Professors sort of can take time to submit their documents, and there is a guidance for them as well in the information for candidates. You'll see that there is guidance for professors, or sort of for referees to look at when they're writing their reference letter. And I would highly recommend that you send it to them and sort of tell them that this is what the scholarship is about, and this is what they're kind of looking for when you're writing the statements, simply because there are obviously a lot of people who don't know what the Rhodes Scholarship is, and it's good to sort of have those conversations with them about it. So that's my very long answer. Sorry.
No way, that was incredible and so comprehensive. Thank you so much, Ms. Ba.
Aishwarya, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Thank you for covering, again, as Namu said, very comprehensively, the main things to look out when you're trying to get recommendation letters. And I honestly don't have too much to add to what you said. I will just make a couple of points specific to my experience, because I'm a medic by training, so I've got an MBBS, and the Rhodes Scholarship is relatively little known in medical schools in India. And also I was one of a class of 250, and that also creates, so I think that one of the things that I found really important in medical school, just because of the nature of the pedagogical system and the kinds of experiences that you have, is that it's important for you to find mentors early on and stay in constant touch with them. Because, for example, you might have a professor that you met in first year who taught you for that 1 year, and then later you went on to do other subjects. But I think it's important to have meaningful conversations with them long after they've stopped teaching you, and keep them updated about your progress, because I think that is the best way to foster a really organic relationship, and also for you to stand out, because a lot of the time in MBBS, kind of really having good relationships with your professors is not emphasized as much as having good relationships with your seniors. So the people who are a couple years ahead of you is emphasized. And I think that that's a bit of a mistake, because you end up not having that relationship, and you end up needing to ask people who might not necessarily know you that well. So I think it's important for you to have that. And it's also really important to, as Ms. Ba said, send them what they're send them the guidance for referees early, and send them your CV as well. And maybe it's worth having a conversation with them before they start before they write the recommendation, explaining to them in person what the scholarship is and what it represents to you and why you're applying for it, what you intend to do at Oxford. And it's pretty much like having an informal interview, as if someone, as if you crack the first round and you've been called for interview, because it's really about making sure that they know the answers to these questions so that they can write you a good letter. Because I think, again, as Ms. Ba has pointed out, the letter should not be generic and it should come from someone who knows you really well. And I think knowing you really well is not limited to only knowing your past achievements or how you study or what you do for the academic referees, but it's also equally important for them to know why you're motivated to apply for this scholarship in particular and why Oxford is the place for you to be to achieve what you want to achieve. So I think that's an important consideration, and having a good conversation with them in advance would really help with that so that they're caught up to speed. And I had so in my year we were requested to submit 4 letters of recommendation, 3 from academic referees and 1 from a character referee. So I had 3 of my medical school professors write the academic referees, and these were people whom I'd endeavored to keep in touch with. So 2 of them were first year professors who taught subjects I'd loved, and I'd made an effort to keep in touch with them and keep them updated on my progress. And 1 was a pediatrics professor from final year who'd also supervised me on a research project. And my character referee was my PI from a lab that I did some research at another institution, not in my medical school. And I think, yeah, just letting them know a few weeks well in advance. These are busy people. So again, letting them know well in advance that you require a letter of recommendation, setting up a meeting to explain things about the scholarship, introduce them to like the interface where they have to submit their letter and explain why you're applying for the scholarship, what you hope to do in Oxford, and why this is the right choice, and also to clarify things about your background that they have actively helped you with or that you think are going to really shape your, because again, you will have a long CV with plenty of different things, plenty of different elements in it, but they might mean different things to you, and you might choose to emphasize different things in your own application, and there are some that are more important than others. So again, talking to them about the key experiences that have shaped you and that are motivating you to apply for the scholarship is, I think, really, really useful. And that, as I said before, kind of comes from having a relatively long association. So identifying the people whom you've constantly kept in touch with and endeavoring to just stay in touch with them even during this process, I think is very, very important, especially in medicine where it's so easy to, because you switch between so many different rotations and subjects that it's easy to not be consistent. Sachin, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Aishwarya. A lot of ground has already been covered, so I'll just reiterate a couple of points relevant to my specific context when I had applied, because I was neither in a professional course like law or medicine, and nor was I a graduate at that time. So I was only 2 years deep in college. It was in a 3-year undergraduate program. So I didn't have like a second institution to seek out referees from. So we had to submit 6 letters of recommendation, 5 academic, 1 character. All my 5 academic referees were from college, so they were professors who had taught me. And my character referee was actually my high school teacher who had actually been very involved with my extracurriculars back in school for many years. Even though I did think if a college professor would be more suited to writing the LOR simply because they are more accustomed to requests like this. I had to explain to my high school teacher what the LOR should be like, give them some information. They also received the information once I'd signed them up on the portal. But I think it was the right decision to go with my instinct. Whoever you think will write a good character reference for you would be best suited, irrespective of the designation, irrespective of the situation, whether or not they are sort of, immediately involved in your life at that moment. You should think about getting that person on board. Because some people have a much deeper insight also because so my high school teacher had also taught me in middle school. So she had seen me over years and knew about sort of my aspirations, my motivations for applying to Oxford. And, in a way that gave me the confidence to request her for a reference. So if you think that, you are also like someone who's only 2 years in college and do not have a second institution to seek out references from, you can always go back to your school. It's not a bad idea, actually. It's also important to not seek references specifically from big names in your field, even if you have worked with them, unless you're absolutely sure that they have some personal insight to offer relevant to your specific case when they're writing the letter in your support. So I had worked as a research assistant with two fairly renowned historians, but I didn't get a letter of recommendation from any of them because I felt that my college professors who had taught me, for more than 2 semesters, 3 semesters, had a far better working relationship with me and a deeper understanding of my capacity, my work, my sort of, context than people with whom I have worked for a month only. But that shouldn't prevent you from asking someone to write a letter who did not teach you for very long. So one of my referees was not even my sub-discipline professor. So she was a philosophy professor. I'd taken one course with her in my second year. But that course really meant something for me. That course really opened my minds in ways that the core courses did not. And we had we bonded over the course in a way that I did not in other courses. So I felt that she would be a very nice person to write a letter of recommendation for me specifically. So if you do have that experience of really an immersive experience in a single course and have a very good existing working relationship with the professor who has taught that course, even though that professor might not have taught you, marked you for many years, if you're confident, you should ask them for the letter of recommendation. One last thing is that you should also have backup referees in mind. This is a practical advice. It might so happen that people, for all sorts of reasons, some of which have been already talked about, might not be in a position to write the LOR for you at that moment. For me, it was one of my favorite professors who was actually changing institutions. He was quitting the college where I was studying and going to another university, taking up another teaching job. He was in the middle of all this, and he would have written letter for me had it not been for COVID, which had sort of stalled the process in all sorts of ways. And I had to sort of ask someone else to write the letter instead. And eventually it worked out. But asking early and having backup referees in mind always helps, because you never know what happens in someone's life in the course of 2 months. And they might have said yes initially, and then can come across some reason which forces them to withdraw from the task, or some other reason, some other engagement, some conflict of interest that might occur, and they might not be able to write a letter for you. So you should have ample time and people on your mind who you can fall back on. So even if you only need 5 referees, 4 character, 3 to 4 character academic, and 1 character referee, you should actually have 6 to 7 people on mind potentially. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you all for all that incredible advice. I think one little PSA is, oh, yeah, Ms. Ba?
No, sorry, just finish and then I'll just add a point. Sorry.
Yeah, yes. Actually, why don't you add that point before I move on? Because I'm going to ask another question, our last question, before we go into the Q&A.
Okay, no, I just want to clarify, because I think I see a few questions related to this, is that an academic referee has to be someone who's taught you or graded you in the degree that either you're doing right now or in the degree that you did before. So either in your undergraduate or your postgraduate degree. And a character referee would be somebody outside of that. So even if they're a professor who you've done an RA-ship with, or who you've generally been in conversation with or have worked on a project with, if they've not taught you or graded you any course on your undergraduate or postgraduate degree, they don't count as an academic referee, they count as a character referee. So an academic referee is somebody who's part of your institution where you're doing your undergraduate or postgraduate degree, and has necessarily taught you any module or a number of modules on your program. And so that is an academic referee, and then everyone else would fall under the bracket of character referee. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification, Misbah. I think that's really helpful. And also, I think we're going to start moving into the Q&A very shortly. I think I just have one last question for the panelists before we head there. But just to sort of prep yourself while you think about this, we'll be answering questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, just put it in the chat. The second is, I'm just going to put a message to everyone of where you can get information. That's, the list of courses, more information about the scholarship, and more rigorous details. I think that's important to know. And the third thing is, obviously, panelists feel free to use your discretion if you want to answer questions or not in the Q&A. But one general guidance for asking your questions and general guidance for us answering your questions is, we're going to try prioritizing questions that are most generalizable and less on your specific context. If you have questions on your specific context, I actually encourage you to put it in the informal Google group. But at the same time, even there, I would encourage you to ask questions that are generalizable. And because, we have not served on an application on the selection round. So whatever advice we can give there, we can't really say whether your specific context will be selectable or not, or like we aren't proxies for the selection committee, but rather we have people who have gone through the process and perhaps can inform you more on what could be helpful strategies on the process side rather than on the selection side. So I just want you to keep that in mind, and we will go into the Q&A in 5 to 10 minutes, but I have one last question to ask before we go there, and maybe we can keep our answers to a minute or two. Maybe 5 minutes, because this is actually quite a good meaty question. One thing for me personally that was really hard about the process was it felt extremely stressful to me, and it felt very like there was quite a lot of pressure. And there were ways that I feel I look back on that I managed that were helpful and not so helpful. So maybe as a last answer, how would you recommend applicants through this process to take care of their health, take care of the stress and the pressure that could go through this process? What do you think was helpful for you? And maybe whoever feels called to can start.
I can start, and I'll keep it very short. It is definitely, as you said, Namo, it's an extremely difficult time, I think, because if you are doing sort of introspection, thinking about yourself, what you want to do, why you want to do it, it can be a little overwhelming. Not little, actually, it can be quite overwhelming. And especially if you're managing that with your course, if you're managing that with extracurricular activities, with more generally personal life, all of this, it's hard to obviously do all of that. I think what was helpful for me was that one, I mean, obviously, other than the many COVID anxieties that were sort of surrounding us at that time, I was at home with my parents and my sister. And that just meant that I was sort of shielded in a way from just like outside world, and it was easy for me to shut off when I needed to. And I just, so I did that. And I also had a lot of conversations with my dad and my sister, and both of them were, people who've like have no idea about like applications and scholarships or anything like that. So it wasn't like I was talking about what should I write in my SOP, what should I write my personal statement, how should I draft my CV, or who should I ask for my reference letter. These were not, sort of questions that pertain to the application, but these were just general conversations of, oh, like, I'm really passionate about, looking at this thing in law, and just sort of having conversations on that, or more generally also just talking about myself and not just myself but generally about life, just having conversations with people who you feel safe and comfortable with, I think really help take the anxiety away from the process. And sometimes if I was thinking of a question that I had in my head, I'd just like tell them, oh, I'm thinking of this, and we just keep talking and talking. And I think that really helped me in what I was doing, and all of the anxieties that came with the process. And I think obviously it was a different time and context because it was, COVID time, everything was closed, we were all at home. So it would obviously be different now. But if you are more comfortable talking to your friends, if there's, people who you just want to hang out with and have a chat with, do that. I mean, again, as I said, like the Rhodes Scholarship is a way to facilitate something you want to do. Um, it's one of the things that you're doing in your life, and I would definitely recommend that don't let it overtake everything that you're doing, and don't let it sort of overwhelm you in a way that this is the only thing that surrounds you. Give yourself time off to do things that you like. But yeah, that's about it. So Chintan.
Very similar experiences, because I was also one of the applicants in the COVID year cycle, and in ways we were shielded, in ways I think because I was back home, not in Delhi, not in college, also with my family, shielded from distraction, so to say, so I could focus better. But also there was a lot of added anxiety of that year, that life as I knew it before March 2020 ceased all of a sudden, and it sort of jolted me out of my comfort zone a lot. So it was difficult to get accustomed to the feeling of pursuing this thing that at that point did not even seem real or to matter that much, with all the deaths and tragedy surrounding us, and all the news pouring in from all quarters, even from really personal quarters, getting all sorts of information. But what I felt enabled me to keep my head down and go through the application round was to not put my life on a pause. So COVID had already put my life on a pause in a certain way, but I did not let the application anxiety itself put my life on a pause, because I felt it was a marathon. It's not a sprint. So it was something I was doing over several months. I was doing alongside my coursework that was going on online. But I also had to, I used to regularly call up my friends, ask about their health, and sort of discuss life in general with them. So it might actually help to have a support system that you can fall back on during the application process, and not insulate yourself from everything. Total insulation is probably not the best way, even for introspection. You can compartmentalize your day. You can have time, specific hours when you think about the application, when you work on it, but don't make it a 24/7 engagement that takes your attention off of everything else, family life, friendships, other work that you might be engaged in. And also don't let the thought of any possible outcome overwhelm you. The process is intimidating, and throughout the process, I think many of the applicants, if not most, including me, experience what is known as, the imposter syndrome, even before sort of getting the scholarship. I would feel that I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving it. I am not the person, I'm not the type of person who gets this, and the outcome is certainly not going to be going my way. So why should I even prepare for this. But then deep into the process, I realized that this is a provocation. This is a provocation for myself to know me better. And no preparation ever goes to waste. And this is one of the many things I'm pursuing. This is only a means to an end. And no matter the outcome, the people who are close to me, their opinion of me will not change. So it's important to have that sort of faith in yourself and sort of power through the application process. And just keep in mind, no matter the outcome, you matter. Your self-worth is not tied to the application and how it's assessed. Aishwarya?
Thanks. You guys both collectively made a lot of excellent points. And again, I probably would only add a couple of things that are kind of specific to my experience. And you both mentioned that kind of life was on a bit of a pause when you both applied, because it was the COVID application cycle. So you were applying essentially in 2020, right, for the 2021 scholarship. But I think just because I was in my internship year when I applied for the scholarship, and there was a pandemic going on even in 2021, I felt that the period at which I applied, I think it was kind of different for me, because instead of being on a pause, it was like they opened the throttle on my life, because I was working overtime in the hospital and also trying to study for a licensing exam. Because I think, so I pretty much applied for the scholarship on more of a whim, I guess, because it was not something that I'd been actively thinking about during my MBBS. And I came across it when I actually just read a book written by another Rhodes Scholar from India. And I remembered it randomly during my internship. And I knew that I had to come up with a CV and personal statements anyway, because I was planning on applying to a residency in neurology and taking the licensing exams for that. So I think that when I was, so because of the fact that I was working and studying for this exam, I naturally had to interleave my application process around all these other things. And like Misbah and Suchintan have said, conversations with friends and family helped me the most when I was trying to think about what I wanted to put down in the application. And for a person who doesn't do well with word limits, which are a big factor in your application process, I think the thing that my way of dealing with that was to have all these conversations, was to just think in an unfettered manner and write down everything, just a kind of stream of consciousness written on paper approach that I then later refined and restructured. So that's something that took a lot of the pressure away for me, and also viewing that as, like Suchintan said, an investment in myself that was going to pay off no matter what, because it's literally forcing myself to look in a mirror and answer all the questions that work and the pandemic and studying had allowed me to ignore for a long time, but ultimately were the questions that would define my life and my career. Just viewing this as an exercise in that helped to take a lot of the pressure off and helped me to realize that if nothing else, I'm going to come out of this with a strong sense of self. I think that really helped to take the pressure off, and combining it with these conversations and interleaving it with other stuff that I naturally had to do being in the hospital and studying for exams also made sure that I was not obsessing 24/7 on the scholarship. So yeah, that's just what I experienced. Namu, want to round it off?
Sure. I think of us, I might have applied for the scholarship before the pandemic, because I applied in 2019. So when life was normal. So I feel I could give that perspective as well, because I feel life has become normal again. So, okay. Well, first off, it really helped that I felt like, weirdly in a way, to feel like the selection, like the percentage of admission was so low. I felt like I had nothing to lose. And I just said, all right, let's just put one in. Let's see what happens, you know, very YOLO vibes. You don't know what YOLO means, you only live once. And yeah, I just felt like that gives you a sort of bravery, which I feel a lot of us have echoed here, of like, you know, when you feel like it's not attached to your sense of self, and you feel like you're not attached to the outcome. And it's one of many opportunities, many ways to succeed in the world, many ways to fulfill your potential. It's just one route. And also to see the process itself as a way to learn and grow. As so many of us have said here, honestly, for me personally, the whole application process, it was very stressful, but also extremely introspective. And I learned so much about myself. And even, through the process, what I wanted to do in Oxford also changed, which is also important to know, like what you apply for may not necessarily be what you eventually apply for in the Oxford admission round. So the entire introspective process itself of applying for the Rhodes further clarified what I wanted to do when I entered Oxford, whatever I did later. So just to see it as a really deep investment in yourself and an opportunity to learn and grow is like a really good way to reframe it. And also on a practical perspective, make sure that you're having like good self-care. These are things I can say now. This was not something I was good at when I was applying. I didn't really have a good work-life balance or a good, sense of boundaries on this. But I can say now from lots of troubleshooting that, if I could go back in time, I would really make sure that I had good sleep, good nutrition, making sure that, you're taking care of your basic needs, especially if you live away from home, like I did, and I lived in a different country. So I think it's really important to really make sure that your basic needs are covered, that you're really talking to folks who you care about and love and who know who you are beyond just, like an application. So, make sure you're connecting to the human that you are through this process. And that's really important. Okay, so thank you all for your incredible answers. Aishwarya, what would you like to add?
Oh, I just wanted to add to the point that you made, which is an excellent one, about the fact that your course and your interests can change after you apply for the scholarship. And I just wanted to make the point that mine did, because the course that I mentioned in my application, even though it was also in neuroscience, it was a different course. And then I'm currently pursuing a course that is different to that, although it's again within the same field. But I think I would just want to say that in the application, they're testing your ability to provide a strong justification for what you want to do at that point. And so they're essentially testing your ability to think through how what you've done aligns with what you want to do and provide a good reason for why you want to do what you want to do. But there are multiple points at which that is going to change. So that can change between you submitting your written application and you attend an interview. That can change between successive rounds of interviews, and that can change after you get the scholarship to when you actually apply to Oxford. And I think, again, as long as you demonstrate that you have a strong reason for why your interests have evolved and why they have evolved in the natural way that they have, I think that is totally fine. And there is flexibility. So you don't have to have every single aspect of your future course figured out at this stage, but it is important to know broadly what you want to do and have a really good reason for wanting to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think that's a point that I don't think it's actually really important to consider, because when you put in this application, you're literally showing potential, right? You're showing that this is what I'm taking all the facts of my life as supporting evidence for what I could do if you give me this opportunity. I think that's
exactly
how it's written down. It's literally that. It's literally showing potential. Yeah. And obviously, I do recommend, though, from my experience, that you can do whatever you want, right? But like, I do think it's really helpful if you try to apply for something in that Rhodes process that is similar to what you think you'll end up applying for, because you can repurpose a lot of application materials, repurpose the letters that you're using, and you'll really thank yourself when you reach that point, because you're like, oh my God, I don't want to redo this process again. So yeah, I feel like though we've kind of answered some of those questions. All right, so unless people don't have anything to add, I think we should move to the Q&A, because we have 30 minutes left in the webinar. And again, just look at the chat. We've put in information that would be helpful for you to look everywhere. one thing that I want to encourage again and reiterate is we are going to try answering questions that are generalizable, aren't necessarily about your chance of selection, because we can't really speak to that. And also, whatever you haven't been able to answer here, because we have limited time, unfortunately, won't be able to answer everything. Please look through the informal Google group, which I've put the link for. Lots of years worth of questions have been answered there. And if you feel that your question hasn't been answered before, over all the years, then feel free to ask that question there. And also, look, I'm sure your question also has been answered in some capacity in any of the official or unofficial documents. So having said that, I'm going to try highlighting some questions that I feel are useful and haven't really been answered by what we've said already. So there's this question here on, does a Rhodes Scholarship improve our chances to getting into Oxford? So I guess let me reiterate that. Do we feel by getting the Rhodes, does that improve your admission chance into Oxford? And I have, I guess, an answer for that, but does anyone else want to go for that?
No, but just a clarification that the Rhodes Scholarship is only for doing a course at Oxford. And so if you are applying for the Rhodes Scholarship, it means that you are interested in studying at Oxford. And so it's not that this is a scholarship to study in any other institution but Oxford. So that link is definite. But does it increase chances or not? I'm gonna let Namu answer that.
Okay, this is actually quite a nuanced question, which is why I picked it. It really depends, right? For instance, in my experience as a PhD student, right, it's actually quite hard to get funding as a PhD student in as an international student, right? If you're like British, there's like research councils that would fund you based on your citizenship. There are much lesser scholarships, and especially post-Brexit, that would fund someone who's non-British. So it's highly likely to get admission into a PhD program in Oxford or Cambridge or anywhere, but just not get funding, right? So from that perspective, if you come in with your own funding, because by the time you apply to Oxford, you will know whether you have this funding or not. I think that is helpful to swing your chance of saying, hey, like I am a student who comes with funding. Obviously, you have to reach a criteria where the PI, the principal investigator, feels like you actually would be of value in the lab, but certainly they would rather pick you over someone who is probably equally talented but doesn't have funding, right? So in that sense, maybe from a research perspective, yes, but from another sense where that isn't necessarily the limiting factor, no, right? There have been enough like there are enough scholars who I don't say this to scare you, but there are some cases where you can get the Rhodes Scholarship and not get into Oxford, right? Which is why I think the changes to the selection make sense, right? Where they've separated this personal statement and this academic statement. And the academic statement is really what you will be using to apply to Oxford. And through the process, they've tried to make it such that it's very, they're selecting not only someone who would be a good Rhodes Scholar, but someone who they feel is a competitive applicant to Oxford. So just to keep that in mind, it is possible. It doesn't happen often though. And I know of extremely few people where that is the case. But yeah, I guess this is a nuanced situation. And I wonder if anyone else has something to say, or we can possibly answer something else.
I would just add a last point to that and say that, yeah, I definitely agree with you on the funding part, because when you come with your own funding, PIs are more likely to be interested in you and take you on, because the lab, their funds are also kind of tight sometimes, right? So you might be very interested in working with someone who doesn't necessarily have the bandwidth to take on a student. But if you come with your own funding, that can change, because if you have a project that aligns with their interests and they've got the equipment, but not necessarily like the funding for consumables or your specific project, you coming with your own funding would change that, and they'd be willing to take you on. And although people, and I think the scholarship also just improves your chances on in a more subtle sense, because it's one of the few that's given out before you apply to Oxford. So the trust actually supports you while you apply to the school. So they review your application materials, they give you some kind of, there's a huge scholar community that you then get exposed to once you get the scholarship. So there's opportunities for you to talk to people who have taken your course before, to find out about what requirements the course has and what course might be the best fit for you given your interests. And I think having access to the wider scholar network and community really helps you while you're applying. So while somebody who's become a scholar getting rejected from Oxford outright is quite rare, people have often not gotten the course of their first choice and things like that, which again, while uncommon, does happen. So I think it definitely improves your chances, but with these nuances, as Namu pointed out.
Just to, again, sorry, add a line that I don't know if this is a STEM thing, but in law, even if you are a Rhodes Scholar coming with funding, there's no guarantee that you'll get a DPhil offer. In fact, there have been cases where scholars with funding haven't, gotten offers. So maybe it's a department question about how it works, but yeah, just thought it'll be good to add that.
If I may just also pitch in here, it so happens that at least in the humanities division, the scholarship is looked upon as something that is, something that's an addition to your profile when they're assessing your application. So scholars have found out, when their applications were assessed for a course, and they can request for a copy of that application assessment form from the university. It was seen that the having the Rhodes funding is mentioned, and it's mentioned in a positive note, but not sure if that mention on a positive note is enough to constitute as a guarantee for getting into the course, especially in graduate courses which are not DPhils, and DPhils are less competitive than actually taught masters courses. So the more competitive the course is, and you can figure this out by checking out the course page on the university website, where they will mention the approximate number of applicants each year and the approximate number of places that are awarded each year. And that ratio might tell you how competitive the course is. So on the one hand, while having the scholarship might add to your profile and might be acknowledged formally in the assessment by the faculty board, it's not necessarily a guarantee that you will get into a very competitive course if it happens to be the one that you're applying to.
Thank you all. That was all really helpful. And again, things I wish I knew before I applied. The next question I have, I think, is actually something that's going to be an interesting, I'm just curious to see what we're going to think about this. But there's a question here about what chance someone has versus applying from a big institution versus like a not as well recognized institution. And I guess also how there's been this trend of Rhodes Scholars over the years who've come from elite institutions, who've come specifically from Delhi. And I just feel we all have different experiences on this. And I just feel, obviously, I don't think we can speak to the selection committee side, but definitely as applicants and definitely as scholars and residents, I'm sure we might all have some interesting perspectives on this point. And I wonder who would like to start us off.
I can go ahead if that's okay. So my institute is probably a less well-known one, depending on how you look at it. I'm from Hyderabad and I studied my MBBS in Osmania Medical College. And while it is a fairly well-known medical school, it's not it's a standalone medical school. So it's not part of like a larger multidisciplinary university, like for example, DU or anything like that. And I think that in my previous years, I know of just one senior who would applied for the scholarship, like for the written round. So the Rhodes Scholarship was definitely not well known, and I spent quite a bit of time explaining to the people I asked for references and to people who asked me about what I was doing, what the scholarship is, and why I wanted to apply for it. So I think that being from a less well-known institution is definitely, it might create some practical difficulties on your end simply because you might have had less people from your particular institute apply before, and you might have difficulty judging whom to pick when asking for a reference. And we've mentioned that again, it's always best to go with someone who knows you really well and has followed your progress. But I think so while there are those practical difficulties, I think that ultimately the application process is in many ways, when the selection panel is in many ways blind to where you come from, and they're more interested in what you're bringing. And that is to an extent a function of your institution and the opportunities that you've been exposed to because of your institution, but it's also a function of what you make of it, because especially in today's world when you have the opportunity to, because there are so many educational resources online, and I know that so many people did remote research. One of the scholars from India in my year, Ritika, she did remote research during the pandemic when she was on lockdown for a university in California looking at sleep in seals. So I think they also look for how dynamic you are as a person. And while your institution can hold you back and push you forward in many ways, I think more than 50% of what you bring depends on you and not where you're from. So I think definitely, and I know that there have been lots of efforts, especially in recent years, to improve outreach and improve access of the scholarship to people who are from less well-known places. So don't let where you come from make you hesitate in applying, because there have been an increasing number of people, especially in recent years, who come from very diverse backgrounds and very diverse institutions that have probably had their first scholar ever only in recent years. So definitely don't let that hold you back, and don't think that you will be at a disadvantage because of the place you come from when you apply.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a point on this, but before I go, is there anyone else who feels they can add and has a point on this?
I think I can sort of make a very minor point, which is that even when applicants are from, the so-called perceived elite institutions in India, if you see the profile of recent scholars and scholar elects over time, what has happened is that the background of these people speak to, you can actually see how diverse their backgrounds have been in the recent years, because the selection committees have made a conscious effort to train themselves in unconscious bias. So I saw there was a question in the panel about whether how you speak English matters. I think that the committee receives active training to not, let how you come across your diction influence their decision over what you bring to the board, as Aishwarya was talking about, what the content of your application is. And they're trained in a way to look at your application holistically. So nobody is just looking at your grades. Nobody is just expecting yet another very similar stellar CV. Nobody is just looking at one part of the statement of purpose, but considering it as a whole and in the context of other applications that they're receiving. So in a way, the process is, even though you fill in the details about your institutions, the process is in a way anonymized because of so many components that add up to constitute your application. And there is a historic pattern, let's be honest about it, of elite institutions sending disproportionately more people to Oxford through the Rhodes Scholarship. But there also has been a recent trend when students from not so prominent institutions have got the scholarship. 10 years back, in the last decade or so, we have had non-national law school students getting the Rhodes Scholarships at a time when it was thought that only national law university schools send in Rhodes Scholars. So in a way, the selection and outreach focus have changed, and you have a decent shot. But don't rule yourself out. The worst thing that you can do is consider that I am from a less known institution, a sort of regional institution, so I do not stand a chance and I will just not apply. That's the worst thing to do, to deselect yourself. Put yourself out there and see what the outcome is going to be from one round to another. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks a lot, Sachintan. Ms. Ba, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, and sort of just to reiterate both what Aishwarya and Suchintan said. And definitely there is, I mean, one is to acknowledge that yes, there is a lot of information asymmetry that happens depending on which institution you come from, which city you're from, what your network is, for personal and professional backgrounds as well, all influence the kind of information you have, the kind of access you get, and that really does change your ability to make a good application. But as both Aishwarya and Suchintan have been saying, both from the side of the selection committee and more generally, there is an effort to make the process more equal in a sense, but also more accessible and approachable. One thing I would also recommend is that if you are from, say, a university or a city where, or personally just don't have any network or are not able to understand how to navigate this, I mean, one is that there is a session like this that where you can ask questions and clarify your doubts. Do use the Google group to ask as many questions and doubts that you have, and all of us will be more active in responding to you. And if you want to reach out to any of us personally to just gently understand or have any queries, specifically if you're coming from an institution where you've not had a scholar and you've gently, there's just no network that is supporting you, I think we'd be happy to help you. And so do reach out if you have any doubts.
Thank you all so much. Those were all really good points. And I feel like the point I had on this was, this is something I've noticed across constituencies. And I do think it's not just an India problem. But one thing I will say is I think webinars like this, the Google groups, the unofficial guides, is our attempt to make this more open source. Because I think oftentimes the reason why I think certain institutes also get more scholars than others is simply because there's an established sort of norm and there's knowledge, this institutional knowledge about how to navigate the scholarship, right? But I do feel like hopefully attempts like this will allow folks to realize actually there's like so many ways to approach this, right? So I went to an elite institution in the US, definitely. So this is very true, right? So obviously I had a lot more opportunities than perhaps my peers did. In getting research and getting involved in some extracurriculars that probably primed me to have enough content for the scholarship. But I want to highlight two things. One is, I think you have, as Aishwarya said, you have to make sure that you can articulate your context. And no matter your context, and if this in the selection committee feels like you've done the best given the opportunities you were given, then I think the sky's the limit. So the most important thing in your application is make sure you have been able to articulate your context, whether that be, okay, I had the global pandemic, this was all I could do, and this is what I did the best with the opportunities I had, right? Because a scholarship is about that. You have to also look at those values that are there, and are you able to show, given the context that you have, that you've been able to live in alignment with those values? And that's the most important, right? So the second thing also is, even though I was in an elite institution, I was in an institution where there wasn't actually a lot of funding for the sort of help, or like I basically had no help from my institution, and it wasn't really their fault. It was simply that they were under-resourced. And there hadn't been an Indian scholar from my institution. And so it really felt like I was shooting blind because I didn't like that each constituency has its own process. It has its own rhythm. And for me personally, what helped invaluably was the unofficial guides, the Google groups. Like I got most of my information from those open source documents. So, you know, definitely it's important to acknowledge the role that being part of an elite institution plays. Definitely it helps in terms of the opportunities that you may have access to. But if you're able to show that you did the best you could with the context you have, you've been able to live in alignment organically with the Rhodes values and the criteria, and you know, you take advantage of all the open source information that's available. And as Mispa said, I think we'll all be happy to help you in particular if you feel like you're coming from one of these institutions. Please, sky's the limit, and please don't count yourself out. Please apply. Okay, we have about 10 minutes, and I think we should have time for about 2 more questions. So again, I would like to encourage you to take advantage of all these open source resources, and we're going to try to answer again the most generalizable questions. One thing that I feel I wish I knew is this question here, and I've seen this echoed a bit in some other questions, which is the question on you want to apply, but you feel like you don't have publications, or do you feel like that's a liability? And I'm sure, you know, this is a question that can articulate depending on your field as well. I'm sure this has its own articulation in law. It has its own articulation in STEM, in the humanities. So I wonder what you make of this question of, do you feel like having a certain track record of achievement is necessary to apply in the scholarship? Because I do think this contributes to a sense of imposter syndrome. So yeah, do folks have a perspective on this?
I can quickly sort of speak about how it is like in the humanities in Oxford. When I applied for the Rhodes, I had one publication, but you know, even in the most academic scholarships in the university, so the university also offers its own scholarships that are not the Rhodes Scholarships, and some of them, unlike Rhodes, have only academic criteria. One of them is the Clarendon Scholarships. I know of people who have got those scholarships without having any publication at all, simply on the merit of their research proposal if they were applying for a research degree, or their statement of purpose if they were applying for a taught master's. So having a track record, like having publications, having certain internships, having things that add to your CV is good. If you have done those, mention them. But if at this stage, when you're already in the middle of the application cycle and you feel like you do not have something that others have, it's no use comparing your unique case with another applicant's. There will always be this one other applicant who you think is more decorated than you. But the selection committee is not looking for decorations. It's not making an investment in you for your past achievements. Past achievements can be interesting markers for how you show promise, but it's all about what you want to do when you come to Oxford, what your plans are, how you are thinking about the research that you want to do here. If you're pursuing a research degree or contribute to whatever field you want to contribute through a taught master's, that should speak to the values, the Rhodes values, the 4 selection criteria. And if without publications, without internships, the selection committee feels that you match those criteria to the best of your abilities, you have a decent shot. So you shouldn't be, too bothered at this stage about getting new publications if you do not already have something. Rather focus on the process and just write the statement of purpose to the best of your ability, and it should see you through.
I have a quick point to add to that as well, because I also had one publication when I'd applied for the scholarship and another one in review. And I think it's important to recognize, I don't know how translatable this is to law and the humanities, but I think it's important to recognize, especially in STEM degrees and in fast-paced, and more so in fast-paced professional STEM degrees like engineering and medicine, where the emphasis very much is on getting a set of transferable skills and knowing the standard operating procedure more than it is on doing original research at that particular stage. So I think it's important to realize that in these fields, whether or not a project that you've worked on gets published depends on a number of factors, and only one of those factors is you and the work that you've put in, because it depends on whether the PI is going to continue pursuing that project once you've left, whether there's enough momentum that it gains in order to generate enough material for publication, and that it might come out, it might be in review at the time that you apply. So there are so many factors out of your control that determine whether or not your name is going to be in print. But none of those factors have anything to do with how much knowledge you gain when you work on that project. And whether you work on a project that kind of fizzles out after 2 months and it never goes to completion, or you manage to get a full-fledged paper out of it. I think fundamentally what the committee will assess is how much you've learned from it and what your takeaway from the project has been that is going to shape what you do in the future. So I think, as Suchintan said, don't let a lack of publications prevent you from highlighting what you've done and apply for the scholarship, because ultimately, and it is also kind of emphasized in the fact that most of even the research degrees in Oxford say that while publications are of merit when applying, they are not a requirement. So I think more than anything, they want to see your potential. They want to see you think. They want to see the way you think about the questions you want to answer. And they are aware of the fact that whether or not something you've worked on has gone to publication is dependent on several factors, of which you are only one.
I agree. I want to say this was really important. I had no publications when I applied for the Rhodes Scholarship. My paper came out after I got the Rhodes Scholarship. And I think it's really important to highlight this. Like, again, this goes to the point that it's not formulaic. And I definitely had imposter syndrome when I was applying, and I thought, oh man, I'm applying with all these people who have all these publications, blah, blah, blah. But again, I think if you can articulate your specific story and what you've done, given the opportunities that have been presented to you and what has happened to you, as Aishwarya said, with factors that are outside of your control, I think that's more than enough. And, the committee is really evaluating based on your personal context, your personal story. So, and different fields also have different publication rates. Different institutions, different undergrads are set up differently. I know in mine, research is not an explicit part of the experience. You have to really seek it out and be really lucky that a supervisor will take you on, let alone that you would get a publication from it as an undergrad. So yeah, I think this is really important to keep in mind, that you can get in with no publications. It's very important to know. I am living evidence of this. So, all right. I'm going to see, I think we have about 5 minutes. I have a recommendation for the panelists, and you can let me know what you think. I think there's a lot of questions in the chat, and I wonder if it makes sense if with the 5 minutes we have, we actually just spend that time collectively just answering the questions in the chat non-verbally, so we reply, because I think it might be hard to really go in depth on a question. So does that make sense? We spend our last 5 minutes trying to answer questions that have been presented in here. Okay, so that's, I think, what we're going to do. So we have about 5 minutes. We're going to do the best we can to answer as many questions as we can. And I will close it in about 5 minutes. So yes, again, if you have questions that we weren't able to answer and you feel like it hasn't been answered in the informal Google group or in our discussion here, please ask it in the informal Google group, and we'll do our best to answer it there. And again, we can't talk about your specific context, but we'll try to prioritize answering generalizable questions. So, all right, I'm going to sit and look and see, are there any questions that we can